All right, here's our summary video for Tuesday, September 22nd. Just a brief reminder of what we've been trying to accomplish. We've been working our way through the sources of the conflict myth and specifically asking ourselves whether those sources have merit or not. Should we, in the end, conclude that there really is conflict between science and faith? So we looked through these five different um, possible sources for the conflict myth. We saw the Enlightenment thinkers and their conceptualization of history. We saw the secularization thesis given to us by scholars in the 1800s working off of the Enlightenment work. We saw that there are mistakes made by the church, with Galileo, for instance, most famous and obvious example of some conflict between science and faith. We do recognize that there is a sort of anti-intellectualism in the church in the 20th century, especially in America. And we're going to deal with the last one today, which is this idea of science necessitating atheism, a methodological atheism. So as we worked our way through it, we recognized the weaknesses of each of these approaches and each of these sources for the conflict myth. With the conceptualization of history for the Enlightenment, we notice that they venerate the classical age more than is healthy. They denigrate what they call the Dark Ages beyond what is accurate. Certainly, there are problems during the Dark Ages, but um, they're really not dark. There's technology and engineering happening during the Dark Ages that's beyond the wildest dreams of those during the Classical Age, for instance. This is going to lend itself right into the secularization thesis, which had essentially promised that the world would get less religious and also that would be positive. Instead, what we find is that the world didn't get less religious, and also, more than that, what we found was that if you study the irreligious aspects of the 20th century, the leaders in the countries that tried to secularize, you actually find big issues. I only gave you the most famous and obvious examples, but if you look at the Soviet Union, or if you look at Nazi Germany, or if you look at Pol Pot's Cambodia, what you find are people who are trying to essentially secularize their nation, or maybe more accurately, turn their nation state into a religion itself. Those are the really problematic places. More people die a violent death during the 20th century than in all other centuries combined. So what we find then is that the secularization thesis has failed. Peter Berger tells us, well, the world's not getting less religious, and we even see from Rodney Stark why that would be. I'm going to post this PowerPoint in Teams for you so that you can have a copy of it, because I know there's a lot of very wordy slides. I like to give you the work from the scholars themselves so that you can see that we're not playing fast and loose with their work. We're trying to give you the heart of their thesis statements. What we were trying to do at the end of yesterday was note that anecdotal argumentation is a very poor form of argumentation. If you recognize an anecdote and say that it supports your points, you really haven't achieved much, because your anecdote may in fact actually be the exception to the rule. And if you give one anecdote, somebody could simply respond with an anecdote in the opposite direction, or to support the counter thesis. And so somebody who says Galileo proves that the church is against science is at the mercy of somebody else saying, well, look at Sir Isaac Newton. The church supported him and he did science. And so clearly that's not a good way to argue. The more problematic issue, I think, is actually this anti-intellectualism of the 20th century, because it's obvious and it's true that the church was anti-intellectual for two basic reasons. The church is anti-intellectual in the 20th century because they were fearful. You see especially Darwin's thesis making its way across the Atlantic Ocean into the United States in the 1920s, hitting the ground very hard during the 1920s, or the fundamentalist response to it, at least sort of coming to the surface in the 1920s, is very fear-based. American Christians abandoned the academy, so to speak, ran from the science departments of the universities and the philosophy departments of the universities, afraid of what intellectual pursuit might do to their faith. Also, a second thing is that they said, well, here, fideism, that somehow faith necessitates a lack of evidence, or that faith is more virtuous if it lacks evidence. But what we saw is that the word faith in the New Testament is not best understood as belief. We looked at this through our reading. And this word pistis is best understood as loyalty or allegiance. And my major point is this, that if faith really means loyalty or allegiance to Jesus and to his way, then what that should actually imply is that I give everything I've got to Christ, my mind, body, and soul, and leverage it for his kingdom, which would mean then that there's no virtue to be found in turning my brain off. There's no virtue to be found in trying to have belief that has no evidentiary support. And moreover, it's true to say that Jesus does not withhold evidence from his followers. The very true pattern that we see in the New Testament is that every time somebody requests reason to believe, Jesus meets them where they are. Nicodemus comes to him in the night and Jesus speaks with him. John the Baptist asks questions from jail and Jesus answers them. Thomas says, I won't believe until I see the scars. And Jesus says, well, here's the scars. There's no place in Scripture that says you must believe without evidence. Now, certainly there are aspects of our belief that we don't yet see in full, but it doesn't mean we don't have reason to believe. And I want to make sure we understand that, because we want to see that there's actually a relationship between faith and reason. We might say that reason can support our faith. And I'm going to say that actually our faith animates our pursuit of reason. We want to come to understand God more fully because we have faith in him, so we pursue understanding through reason and rational pursuits. Today, what I want to do is talk about the genesis of science, because I think that if we do this, we will understand that there can't be, or doesn't need to be, conflict between science and faith, because actually science is born out of faith. This is the very surprising thesis from Alfred North Whitehead. He's a philosopher of science from the early 1900s. He's British. He himself is not a religious person. And he was a leading scholar on the questions of science and philosophy in the early 1900s. He's not the only person in the conversation, but he's certainly prominent in the conversation. And the quotes that I'm about to give you are actually from a lecture that he delivered at Harvard. It's actually a lecture that sort of flipped everything upside down. Everybody entered the 1900s with the assumption that science and faith were at odds with one another, in conflict. And he said, to the contrary, that science is in existence because of faith, that faith brings science into existence. Here's a quote. He says, the greatest contribution of medievalism to the formation of the scientific movement was the inexpugnable belief that there was a secret which can be unveiled. How has this conviction so vividly implanted in the European mind? It must come from the medieval insistence on the rationality of God, conceived as with the personal energy of Jehovah and with the rationality of a Greek philosopher. Every detail was supervised and ordered. The search into nature could only result in the vindication of faith and rationality. Here's what he's saying. He's saying that the Christian scholars, the medievalists, believed that science was both possible and desirable. Science is possible because they believe that God is rational and would therefore create a rational universe. That you could investigate the universe and find the reason that ties things together or holds things together. And that's true because God is rational and reasonable. If God was irrational, then his creation would also be irrational and impossible to study. So they believe that science is possible. God is rational, therefore his universe is rational, and therefore science is possible. But more than that, they believe that science is desirable, because they believe that God is knowable, that he's personal, right? The personal energy of Jehovah. So they would say, if I study nature, I come to know God. So not only is studying nature possible, not only is doing science possible, but it's desirable. One of my favorite quotes that I think bears this out is the quote from Johannes Kepler, the famous astronomer from the 1400s. And Johannes Kepler says, when he studies the stars and the planets in motion and the orbits and the solar system, that he feels like he's thinking God's thoughts after him. He actually feels like he's coming to know God by doing science. So, this Christian conviction that science is possible because God is rational is also motivated then by the desire to come to know him, that science is desirable. Uh, Another way that a medievalist might put this, for instance, Anselm or Aquinas, they might say the Latin phrase fides quaerens intellectum, which means faith seeking understanding. The implication of this phrase that Anselm and Aquinas and others use is that because they believe in God, they are seeking to understand him and his universe in any way that they can. They're motivated and animated to understand the world around them by their faith. They're motivated and animated to know God because they believe in God. So if they can know him through math, let's study math. If they can know him through science, let's study science. If they can know him through studying history or scripture, let's do it. Philosophy, good. Anything we have, let's use it to know God better than we do now. And science is just one of those tools where they could seek understanding of God. They might ask then, beyond that, why not somewhere else? Why did science rise in Europe? Well, Alfred North Whitehead says it's because of Christianity. He also says the flip side is true, that it didn't rise elsewhere because the conceptualizations of God in those places couldn't support science. For instance, right here it says, in other places outside of Europe, the belief in God or the way they thought about God was too impersonal or too irrational to have sustained science. Anything that might have happened, he says, might be due to the fiat of an irrational despot God. Right? So think of Zeus, for instance. Zeus is irrational. But he's also, in the Greek conceptualization of the pagan pantheon, responsible for lightning. So imagine the Greek ages, the classical era or before that, let's say 800 BC, and someone sees lightning strike the hill across the valley. They wouldn't ask themselves, I wonder what natural conditions brought about that lightning. What they would ask themselves is, what is Zeus upset about now? It's this fiat of an irrational despot God that has led to the lightning. Therefore, their curiosity isn't provoked. They don't care to know more about the lightning. They know as much as they need to know that this irrational God has thrown lightning against the hillside. It's also true to say that many religions other than Christianity or Judeo-Christianity think of God as very impersonal, meaning you can't know him. For instance, think of Buddhism. A Buddhist might do great science, but Buddhism didn't produce science because they don't think that there is a God that one can come to know. They think God is entirely impersonal. In fact, that there's no mind of God. And therefore, because there's no mind of God, you can't know God through studying God's creation. In fact, they would say creation is merely a mystery. That studying creation is a waste of your time in the Buddhist theology because, well, that's just a mystery that we can't quite know, and it doesn't benefit us. Confucius would say the same. He would say, don't worry about studying the gods. There's probably no gods, and if there are, they don't have anything to do with you, and so you're wasting your time studying them. And don't worry about the beginning of or the existence of the universe. That's a waste of your time. It's a mystery that you can't solve. You should only think about the ways that you ought to be living. Now, I don't want to suggest that there's nothing beneficial about studying Confucius. He has plenty to offer us. The same can be said about plenty of Buddhist scholars with wisdom about living our lives. But it is true to say that they think of God as so impersonal, and they think of the universe as such a mystery, that it didn't, I would say even couldn't, produce science. Not the way Christianity did. The end result for us is then the proof that we need that science and faith need not be at odds with one another. How could they be at odds with one another if it's faith that produced science, Christianity gave birth to science.